The morning sun rose lazily over the village, its light struggling to penetrate the thick mist that clung to the ground. The once bustling streets were now eerily quiet, with only the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a sparrow breaking the silence. Kenjiro Ishida, his frail figure bent with age, made his way slowly along the cobbled path that wound through the heart of the village. His cane tapped rhythmically against the stones, the sound echoing in the still air. The village had changed in ways that were hard to put into words. Decades ago, it had been a place of life and laughter, where neighbors gathered in the evenings to share stories, and children raced through the narrow streets, their laughter carrying on the wind. Now it was as though the tragedy that had struck had stolen not just lives, but the very soul of the community. Many of the homes were empty, their windows dark and their doors shut tight. Overgrown gardens spilled into the streets, their flowers and weeds mingling in chaotic defiance of the order that once defined the village. Kenjiro paused in front of a small house with a sagging roof and peeling paint. It had once belonged to the Tanaka family, who had run the village bakery. He could still recall the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air each morning, a scent so inviting it had drawn villagers from every corner. Now the bakery was silent, its windows covered in a thick layer of dust. Kenjiro's eyes lingered on the door for a moment before he sighed and continued on his way. The villagers who remained avoided Kenjiro's gaze as he passed. They offered polite bows but said little, their faces marked by a weariness that mirrored his own. Kenjiro understood their silence. The tragedy that had unfolded here was something they carried deep within them, too painful to put into words. For years, they had chosen to bury their grief, hoping that time would heal the wounds. But Kenjiro had come to realize that some wounds festered when left untreated, their pain seeping into the very fabric of the community. As he approached the small shrine at the edge of the village, Kenjiro felt the familiar weight of sorrow settle over him. The shrine, dedicated to the local guardian spirit, had become a focal point of the village's grief. Its wooden steps were worn from the footsteps of those who came to pray for the departed, their offerings of incense and flowers piling up in a quiet testament to the lives lost. Kenjiro knelt slowly, his knees creaking in protest, and lit a stick of incense. The fragrant smoke curled into the air, its tendrils dissipating into the morning light. His thoughts drifted to the children he had once taught, their faces vivid in his memory despite the passage of time. He could still hear their laughter, their curious questions, their dreams of the future. They had been the heart of the village, a reminder of its resilience and hope. Now, their absence was a hollow ache that Kenjiro carried with him every day. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and carrying with it a faint whisper, as if the land itself mourned alongside him. Kenjiro closed his eyes and bowed his head, his mind heavy with unanswered questions. What had truly happened here? Was it an unavoidable tragedy, or had it been the result of human negligence, a failure to protect the people who had entrusted their lives to one another? As Kenjiro rose, his movements slow and deliberate, he turned his gaze toward the forest on the outskirts of the village. Beyond those trees lay the abandoned factory, its rusting shell a grim reminder of a time when prosperity had seemed within reach. It was there, he believed, that the answers lay waiting. The villagers might have chosen to forget, but Kenjiro knew that the past could not be silenced forever. The truth, however painful, had to be unearthed. With a final glance at the shrine, Kenjiro resumed his walk, his cane tapping steadily against the ground. The mist began to lift as the sun climbed higher, but the weight in his heart remained. The village might have been quiet, but Kenjiro knew that silence often concealed the loudest of truths. Kenjiro sat on the wooden porch of his small home, the cane resting across his lap as he gazed out at the village below. It was a quiet morning, the kind he used to cherish, but now the silence was oppressive. The distant mountains, once a symbol of stability and timelessness, seemed to loom over the village like watchful sentinels, their peaks shrouded in mist. The faint sound of wind chimes echoed in the breeze, stirring memories he had long tried to keep at bay. This village had been his entire world. Decades ago, it was alive with energy and laughter, Children ran through the narrow streets, their giggles blending with the rhythmic pounding of the rice mills and the chatter of shopkeepers calling out to passers-by. Kenjiro had been in the heart of it all, a beloved schoolteacher who took pride in shaping young minds. His classroom had been a place of joy and curiosity, the walls adorned with colorful drawings and the laughter of his students filling the air. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, the village seemed to wear its grief like a heavy cloak. Homes stood empty, their windows boarded up or broken, with weeds overtaking once tidy gardens. The small park where children used to play was eerily still, the swings rusting in the breeze. Kenjiro could still remember the faces of those who were gone, students who had sat at his desk, eager and full of dreams. As he sipped his tea, Kenjiro's thoughts drifted to one boy in particular, Daichi. The child had been one of his brightest pupils, always asking questions that pushed the boundaries of the lesson. "Why do the stars move?" Daichi had once asked, his wide eyes sparkling with wonder. Kenjiro had smiled, explaining the concept of celestial motion. But now he wondered if the boy had ever lived long enough to truly understand the answer. The tragedy that had befallen the village had not come all at once. It started subtly, an unusual illness here, an unexplained death there. At first, people dismissed it as bad luck or the inevitable hardships of life. But as the cases multiplied, fear began to seep into the community like a poison. Parents kept their children indoors, elders whispered about curses, and the once close-knit village began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Kenjiro remembered the day the first family packed up and left, their cart creaking under the weight of their belongings. Others soon followed, leaving behind homes filled with memories and a sense of loss that hung in the air like smoke. He had stayed, rooted to the village by a sense of duty and love, but also by a gnawing guilt. As a teacher, he had always felt responsible for the well-being of the children. And now, as their faces haunted his dreams, he couldn't help but feel he had failed them. He shook himself from his reverie, his gaze shifting to the forest beyond the village. It was there, in the shadow of the abandoned factory, that the answers lay hidden. He didn't know how much time he had left, but he was determined to use it. He would find the truth, not just for himself, but for Daichi, for the children, and for the village that had once been his home. Kenjiro's steps were slow but deliberate as he made his way through the forest at the edge of the village. The uneven ground beneath him was damp from the morning dew, and the gnarled roots of ancient trees seemed to reach up, as if trying to trip him. His cane struck the ground with a steady rhythm, a reminder of his frailty, but he pressed on. This path, now overgrown and forgotten, had once been a well-trodden route to the heart of the village's prosperity, a factory that had brought jobs and, perhaps, the seeds of their undoing. The factory stood in ruins now, a hulking skeleton of rusted metal and crumbling concrete. Kenjiro paused at the threshold, staring up at the broken windows and vines that snaked through the walls. The place reeked of abandonment, yet there was an unsettling sense that the past lingered here, waiting to be unearthed. He clutched his satchel tighter, the papers and notes inside a testament to weeks of relentless investigation. Inside, the factory was eerily silent. The faint echoes of his footsteps bounced off the walls, their sound swallowed by the vast emptiness. Kenjiro's eyes scanned the floor, littered with fragments of machinery and discarded files. He bent down, his knees protesting, and picked up a faded piece of paper. The ink was smudged, but he could make out words that sent a chill down his spine. Safety violations and ignored protocols. This wasn't the first clue he had found, but it was one of the most damning. Over the past weeks, he had combed through village archives, interviewed reluctant survivors, and pieced together a timeline of events that pointed to negligence. The tragedy that had struck the village, a mysterious illness that swept through with devastating speed, was no act of nature. It was tied to the factory's operations, to the chemicals that had seeped into the soil and water. Kenjiro moved deeper into the factory, his cane tapping against the cracked floor. He reached a room at the back, where rows of filing cabinets stood in disarray. Many of the drawers had been emptied, their contents likely destroyed or hidden, but a few remained locked. He took a deep breath and began to work, his hands trembling as he pried one open with a crowbar he had brought. Inside were stacks of documents, dusty and yellowed with age. As he flipped through the papers, the picture became clearer. Reports detailing hazardous waste disposal methods, warnings from engineers about contamination, and memos from higher-ups insisting on cutting costs. Each page told a story of greed and indifference, of lives weighed against profits and deemed expendable. Kenjiro's heart ached as he read. These weren't just names on paper. They were his neighbors, his students, his friends. He thought of the children who had fallen ill, the families who had been torn apart. A noise startled him, a rustle from the shadows. Kenjiro froze, his pulse quickening. Was someone watching him? Or was it just the wind? For a moment, he felt the weight of his age and vulnerability, but then he straightened, his resolve unshaken. Whoever or whatever was out there, he would not be deterred. Clutching the damning evidence, Kenjiro stepped back into the light. The forest seemed darker now, but his path was clear. The truth he carried was heavy, but it was his duty to bear it. For the village, for those who had been lost, and for the hope of redemption. Kenjiro's frail hands gripped his cane tightly as he stood outside the village council hall, the weathered wooden door before him, a symbol of the resistance he was about to face. The council had been silent guardians of the village's decisions for decades, but their reluctance to address the tragedy had turned them into shadows of their former selves. Kenjiro took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't here to accuse them. He was here to plead for their courage. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old paper and incense. The council members, a group of men and women he had known for years, sat around a long wooden table. Kenjiro's former students were among them, their faces lined with age and wariness. As he shuffled in, the quiet murmur of conversation died away, replaced by an uneasy silence. "Kenjiro," one of the councilmen greeted, his tone polite but wary. "What brings you here tonight?" Kenjiro didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a stack of papers on the table, evidence he had painstakingly gathered over weeks. Documents, old photographs, and testimonies scrawled in trembling handwriting. The weight of his years and the burden of his search bore down on him, but his voice remained steady as he finally spoke. "I've come to speak for those who no longer can," he said, his words hanging in the air. "For the families who were shattered, for the friends we buried, and for the truth we've ignored." The council exchanged uneasy glances. One woman, Haruka, leaned forward. "Kenjiro, we understand your pain. We all do. But dredging up the past, what good will it do? We've rebuilt. We've moved on." "Have we?" Kenjiro shot back, his voice rising. "Look at the streets outside. Half the homes are empty, overgrown with weeds. The laughter of children has been replaced by silence. Moving on isn't the same as healing." Haruka flinched, but said nothing. Another councilman, Takeshi, frowned. "And what would you have us do? Reopen wounds? Stir up anger against those responsible? Even if what you found is true, it won't bring anyone back." Kenjiro took a step forward, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. "This isn't about vengeance, Takeshi. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring this never happens again. We can't pretend the tragedy was a random act of fate when there are signs of negligence, of warnings ignored." The council fell into silence, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Kenjiro's voice softened. "I remember teaching all of you when you were children. I told you that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. I stand here now, an old man, asking you to remember those lessons. If not for me, then for them." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint creak of the wooden beams. Finally, Haruka spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly do you want from us, Kenjiro?" "I want us to investigate," he said firmly. "I want us to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it is. I want us to honor the memory of those we've lost by ensuring their deaths weren't in vain." The council members exchanged glances, their expressions conflicted. Kenjiro could see the fear in their eyes, but also the flicker of something else. Shame, perhaps, or the faint stirrings of courage. As he turned to leave, he added one final plea. "The truth has a way of surfacing, whether we want it to or not. Let us face it together, as a community. That's the only way we'll ever truly move forward." The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Kenjiro stepped out into the cold night air, unsure of whether his words had been enough. But as he looked up at the star-filled sky, he allowed himself a glimmer of hope. The night of the Lantern Festival arrived, casting a soft glow over the village as people gathered beneath the ancient cherry blossoms. The trees, bare in the cold season, stood as silent witnesses to the moment. Kenjiro leaned heavily on his cane, his hands trembling slightly, but his resolve as firm as ever. The lanterns, carefully crafted by the villagers, sat in neat rows along the riverbank, their delicate paper sides painted with symbols of remembrance and hope. A hush fell over the crowd as Kenjiro stepped forward, his hunched figure illuminated by the flickering torchlight. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd. Many avoided his eyes, their expressions guarded. Others looked at him with a mix of curiosity and unease. But among them, Kenjiro saw something that had been missing for years. Young faces, children holding tightly to their parents' hands. The presence of the next generation gave him a sliver of hope. Kenjiro cleared his throat, his voice hoarse but steady as he began. Tonight, we gather not just to honor those we've lost, but to remember why they mattered. Every name, every face, every life touched this village in ways that shaped us into who we are. But for too long, we've let their memory remain clouded by silence. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Kenjiro could feel it, the tension tightening like a string about to snap. He continued, undeterred. I know it's painful to revisit the past. I feel it in every step I take, in every dream that haunts me. But we must ask ourselves, what do we owe to those who are no longer with us? Is it enough to light lanterns once a year and let the current carry them away? Or do we owe them the truth? A murmur spread through the villagers. Kenjiro saw the village council members exchanging wary glances, their unease palpable. He raised a hand, silencing the whispers. I've spent these past weeks seeking answers. I've walked paths that many of you have avoided, spoken to those who still carry the weight of that day. And I've uncovered truths that some would rather remain buried. His words hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. Kenjiro's gaze softened as he took a deep breath. I'm not here to lay blame or to divide us. I'm here because I believe this village is stronger than its fear. I believe that together, we can confront the mistakes of the past and ensure they are never repeated. The lanterns we send off tonight, they're not just for mourning. They're for hope, for renewal, for the courage to face what's ahead. A single voice broke the silence. But what if it's too late? What if nothing can change? It was a young man, his face shadowed, but his voice trembling with emotion. Kenjiro turned toward him, his expression gentle. It's never too late to honor the truth. Even if we cannot change what happened, we can honor their memory by ensuring we learn from it. The first step is the hardest, but it's also the most important. As the villagers stood in contemplative silence, Kenjiro bent down and lit the first lantern. He waded to the river's edge, his cane sinking slightly into the muddy bank. With a careful motion, he released the lantern into the water, its soft glow reflected on the dark surface. One by one, others followed. The river filled with light, each lantern carrying a fragment of the village's sorrow, hope, and determination. Kenjiro stood back, watching the lights drift into the distance. He felt the weight on his chest lighten, just a little. For the first time in years, the village seemed alive with possibility. Though frail, he smiled, knowing he had done his part.